welcome Silke Schwandt to Leipzig. Once again, not sure when you have been here the last time, I think.
For the Historikertag last year?
Yeah. Oh, Historikertag, yeah. And also for a digital humanities event, I think 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Great to have you back. I know you very well, but I think this is not the case for everybody here in the room, so I will do what is typically expected when important people like you are introduced. I will tell people about the most important stages in your academic career. So I think it all started in Bielefeld. So Silke Schwandt is a trained historian, and I think the next stage of your academic travels was London, and from London to Frankfurt. I think it was also Frankfurt where you did your PhD. And I think in Frankfurt you already started to get more digital, right? So because you started as a traditional historian back in the day, and we will see you digitized yourself in your research, not yourself, but your research through the years. After finishing the PhD in Frankfurt, I think there was another research project in Frankfurt, and then you came back to Bielefeld. I think first as a akademische Rätin, whatever that means in English, as a lecturer. And then you were appointed a professorship for digital humanities and medieval history.
It's digital and medieval history. Now it's only digital history.
Yes, that was my point.
There's a difference.
Showing the incremental digitization of the researcher Silke Schwandt. Because, I saw in your CV, like 2 years ago, you switched the denomination to like just digital humanities. So no more...
History. It's digital history.
Digital history. Sorry, I know.
Sorry, I'm very particular about this.
Still a historian, but digital historian.
Yes.
And no more medieval history.
Well, only as you will see later, there is some medieval stuff going on. So, but it is digital history, yeah.
So that's for the very brief, academic career. As I said, I also know Silke from, the digital humanities community very well. Actually, there's a couple of projects I could mention. I will mention my favorite project, which is, I think it's called eTARDIS. Yes. I never understood what the acronym stands for.
I will tell you later. It's in the presentation.
Okay, so can I spoil it right away? So it's about virtual reality for visualization purposes in history, which is an amazing topic, and you can expect some very nice demonstrations, I guess. But Silke Schwandt is not only, an applied digital historian, she's also very much interested in the theory of digital humanities and digital history. And this is where we, I think, had our last encounter, collaboration. Well, collaboration sounds weird because it was like a staged dispute between a historian and a computer science person, and we didn't really dispute about algorithms. And I introduced algorithms from a computer science perspective, and Silke argued that traces of algorithmicity
yes, that
can also be found in humanities and especially in history research, because you have procedural, very systematic workings, and maybe you will also come back to this in your lecture, I guess. Yeah, so many more important stuff to tell you about Silke, but I think she will present some interesting research herself. Maybe one last important thing, which is very recent in her activities. So Silke is, you can be really happy that she's here because she's really busy right now, because she's planning the Digital Humanities Conference, the German Digital Humanities Conference, DHD. Maybe some of you know it. And it will be in Bielefeld next March, March 3rd to 7, I guess. Yeah, and whoever of you was involved in organizing a conference or even just a workshop knows it's a lot of pain. She's like the head of the local organizing committee, and it's really a pleasure to have you here, despite these efforts of the organization. And if you're ready for your talk, I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Manuel, for the kind introduction. And I kind of second the warm invitation to Bielefeld next year. The motto of the conference is under construction. One, because the campus in Bielefeld is very much under construction. And two, the whole discussion about digital humanities or digital history, whatever it is in this regard, it is our understanding it should be more about being under construction. So trying to build together approaches from different disciplines, a very formal approach from the computer science or computer linguistics, so a very formalized approach when you work with computers, with something that is very interpretive, very hermeneutic, very also proud to be vague and not trying to kind of pinpoint each and every single data point. So that's where the motto under construction comes from. And this could also have been the title of my talk today, but I decided to do something similar content-wise, but to start at a different point. So today I will talk about figuring out the past. Do numbers tell stories? What you can see on the slide is the only hint at artificial intelligence that I'm going to do today. So this is a AI-generated image that you get when you ask, in this case it's OpenAI's DALL-E, to give you a picture about figuring out the past. And I thought this was really interesting because it had all by itself the idea that it's about books and figures. But I'm not going to go and delve into discussions about artificial intelligence. We just had at the beginning, Manuel and I, a little conversation about how much we despise the term artificial intelligence in and of itself. I'm not going to open that box, not today. I will start today with telling you something about where the first part of the title comes from. It is a quote. It's the title of a book by Peter Turchin and Daniel Hoyer. It was published in 2020. And it is called Figuring Out the Past, the 3,495 vital statistics that explain world history. And I have this book, and it sits on my desk, and I always wanted to talk about this book. So this is basically where my idea to make this lecture about the question, what is quantifiable in history, or what kind of quantifiable data can we use when we want to tell histories, or when we want to build historical narratives. That's what my lecture is going to be about today. I quote from the introductory remarks by Peter Turchin, who himself is quite the accomplished historian. And he has a big project about collecting historical data that I'm also going to introduce in a short while. So back to the quote. We are used to thinking about history in terms of stories, who did what to whom. Yet we understand our own world through data, vast arrays of statistics that reveal the workings of our societies. Why not the past as well? Figuring out the past turns a quantitative eye, and figuring out the past is the book, turns a quantitative eye on our collective trajectory. Behind the fleeting dramas of individual factions and rulers, it looks for large-scale regularities. It asks how key social and technological innovations spread around the world, and it pinpoints outliers from general trends. And I think this quote really sort of opens up the space between two poles, the very quantitative, very statistics, very data-oriented interpretations that we maybe associate with social sciences rather than with history. And we tell stories about wars and people and interactions and very sort of unclean kind of way that we, at least according to this quote, have a way to tell stories about history. You can see this in the behind fleeting dramas of individual factions and rulers. I mean, I think this is a image of history that at least I don't share, and that has been maybe present in earlier centuries. We don't do history like this anymore, but I think it's a really interesting starting point for discussing what I wanted to talk to you about today, how data about history and historical work as a historian, so building historical narratives, making historical arguments, how that works together, if it works together, and where it maybe also does not work very well together. I was hinting at the project that is behind this book. It's CESHAT, the Global History Data Bank. I don't know if anybody came across this before. I think also maybe within this particular center here at Leipzig University, could be an interesting look at. The idea of this project is to collect lots of data points or information about history, about global history. And it started with building a global historical sample, as they called it. They looked for 10 world regions, distributed as widely as possible across the Earth's surface, and within each of those regions designated 3 so-called natural geographical areas with discrete ecological boundaries, in average about 10,000 square kilometers in size, thus creating an initial sampling scheme of 30 such areas around the world, later extended to 35. This is taken from the homepage in the description of the project. So this is the areas that they collect data about and data from. They do this in a very sort of a combined process of working together with social science data, but also working on historical sources, reading, extracting that kind of information from what we traditionally would look at. And I quote the homepage again on the slide: most variables in CESHAT require the data to take the form of a number or a numerical range, or they specify a feature that can be coded as absent, present, or unknown. So this is sort of the way that they described how the data bank, the data model actually works. So they usually put in numbers, and they can define categories as absent, present, or unknown. And all data are linked to scholarly sources, including peer-reviewed publications and personal communications from established authorities. So they also try to pick up on sort of the known and established historical narratives. This is what the homepage looks like. So everybody, please feel invited to have a look. If you scroll down, these are some more of the categories that they look for. They have general variables. And this all, maybe this is important, it all sort of evolves around those regions. So they have data for a certain region, and everything is sort of linked to a geographical area. They identify 47 of such regions. They started with 30. They have now 863 polities that were present in these regions at one point or another. They look at general variables, warfare variables, social complexity variables, human sacrifice, lots of different sort of things that could be of interest. They themselves, in this database, claim that they don't offer a pre-constructed narrative. I would always set a question mark behind something like that, because the way that you present your data, the way that you collect your data, the way that you build the data model always already refers to some kind of narrative or pre-constructed understanding of the things that you are looking at, especially if you take it from text that you're reading, right? So it's not like a survey or just sort of counting heads of people. So this is the database for the book. Now let's have a short look at the book. This is the table of contents, and I can share this later because you don't really have to read this now. But as you can see, they have society profiles starting with Egypt, or they have society profiles, and they have sort of 3 categories or 2 categories, ancient and medieval, because the book is trying to give us information about historical periods that we don't know so much about, claiming that about the modern world we know so much and we have so much data that would be comparable to this. So essentially one could argue that with this book and also with the Global History Data Bank, they try to make pre-modern societies comparable to modern societies in a way that we think of societies as being able to be expressed in data, right? Whether or not this is a good idea, we can discuss maybe later on, but this is sort of the general setting. I will show you quickly something medieval, because this is where I know most about. And we'll have a look at the rankings, and we'll have a very short look at also the regional adoption and the maps in the end. So this is the table of contents, and this is what the book looks like. Very authentic, because I just took pictures of the book. So this is what they offer us for France, Carolingian Kingdom, short introductory remarks, and then there's several categories where they just input data. And although the data bank says we only have categories or labels that we fill with numbers, there's some text in here. So it starts with the duration, 752 to 987 CE. Being a medieval historian myself, this is debatable already. This is like the first entry, and we would say, yeah, okay, why this, why not other? I mean, I probably don't have to explain this to the people sitting here, but it's debatable, whether this is the correct date. Then they have the total area, again, at what point in time, what is the extension, how did this change? So as you can see, being a medieval historian myself, I immediately start to question not the facticity, but maybe sort of the point in time that this data point represents, right? So I want to know, why did you decide to say this is the duration? I want to decide why, or I want to know why they decided this is the area that it covered. Then we have institutions, legal code, absent. The Monumenta Germania Historia in Munich, which is an institution that at least medieval or pre-modern historians know very well, are just on the way of doing a re-edition of the Carolingian legal codes, the Capitularia. So again, I'm not so sure. I don't want to bash this, but just to make a point that they're trying to datify something that might not sort of fit this general idea of how we kind of deal with data points that we might have today. And if one of the arguments is to make a book like this in order to make pre-modern societies comparable to modern societies, is that the right way to compare? Or is it even the right way to describe modern societies if we look at modern societies through like a datafied lens or a data perspective, right? Just because it's so much fun, we're going to look at this. 10 largest field armies, ancient, medieval, early modern, in the entire pre-industrial area. This is actually interesting because I have no idea about military history, so this is blank for me. I cannot sort of argue as much as I could with the previous slide. But what is interesting is that this is actually not, like for my students, I would use this to show them that they need to get rid of their European focus. Because medieval history in German universities is mostly Latin Europe. And you can see immediately that at least with standing armies, there is not so many European polities in the list. Of course, here's the Romans. There's lots of East Asian areas on the top. This changes. So here's the Ottoman Empire. And up there, like for the early modern period, we have the Bourbons on top. Interesting. They have a larger standing army than some of the regions that were bigger before. So, I forgot to show you the map. Maybe I can do this over drinks afterwards. Sorry, it's gone. So Turchin argues that we understand our own world through data, and this is an argument that he makes for his contemporary world. Vast arrays of statistics that reveal the workings of societies. I would then like to ask him, what kind of data do you get? How do you collect it? I made this excursion into the data bank to give you an idea of how this generally works. The statement makes it sound as though dealing with data and doing statistics is a very contemporary thing, or at least a very modern thing. Again, maybe this is a void argument within this audience, but obviously, or of course it is not. So there have been lots of historical data practices before. And even Amin Nassei, who some of you might have read, he published a book called Muster in German, now translated into English as Patterns, a theory of the digitized society, argues that digitization, and with it the understanding of data that is most common today, is not something that kind of started when at a point in time where the technology was far ahead enough to represent what we understand when we talk about digitization. It's basically ones and zeros. So it's trying to find something that is quantifiable, that I can count. Digitization comes from digitus, taking your fingers, so it's basically counting, right? And these kinds of practices were in the world long before what we today understand as digitization, and also long before that what we think about when we talk about data or statistics. I think this is important to understand when we try to evaluate how or which role quantifiable facts or data plays in constructing historical narratives, which is where I will be going in by the end of this talk. That it's not something that is here just because we have computers now. And we've been talking about this earlier. There's a long history in historiography also with social history and economic history of the 70s and 80s where people counted things. Historical demography. There's lots of sort of different areas that are part of what we understand as history as a discipline, where quantification is very present. We've had these discussions whether numbers tell stories or not decades ago. We have them now again, and nobody talks about why don't we relate the two discussions to each other. So why do I still have to justify that I work with quantification, setting machine learning and all these fancy stuff aside? Basically, it's quantification. When we had this discussion like 70 years ago, and again and again and again. So also for history as a discipline, this is an interesting observation. I don't quite know what to do with it yet, but I think there's also like a narrative there that we should have a look at. So if we follow Amin Nasseh, and not only him, he argues that digitalization is not only a contemporary phenomenon, but generally helps societies to deal with and reduce complexity by using coded numbers to process information. Make something quantifiable, make it countable. This makes it easier to get an overview, to get control, or apparently get control over complex situations. Which are the data practices that we know historically, and how do we use data practices in history? I've started to kind of get into that question with my earlier remarks. Just a few very random examples. This is a contemporary map from 1903. I did a bachelor seminar at Bielefeld University where we worked on election data from previous German elections. And the students were really surprised that in 1903, we already had all these kinds of diagrams. You know, they have bar diagrams, they have pie diagrams, they have it all. So why is this? I mean, this is 120 years ago. So, you know, there was some irritation, which I think is good to start to get them into questioning certain things. So the way that we deal with data and also visualizations that are so natural to us have been there for quite some time. Another example, all the way back at the beginning of the 12th century, Doomsday Book. I think most of you have already maybe heard of this. This is the first survey of the, like a register of the British population, stating also the land and the land that belonged to certain people. And this is a register that is still more or less valid today because you can go back all the way to the time of William the Conqueror, just after 1066, when he started to record this. I think the first survey of the Doomsday Book is 1080, so at the late 11th century. So counting people, trying to pinpoint areas in which people live and thinking about who is in charge of which area, how does the politics kind of work on the basis of data and statistics is nothing that we haven't seen before. It has a long tradition. So what about the way that we deal with this today? And how does that maybe sort of reopening the discussion about quantification in history, or quantified sources, or like tables and numbers as sources in history. What does that have to do with digital history? And why do I think that we still need to think about this? Another example, and this is important because I'm getting back to this when I talk about the VR project. This is one page within a big book. It was first published in 1952. By Arno Peters and his wife. Arno Peters was a historian and geographer, And he collected lots of information again about historical events in different world regions, and he published a book about it. And it's a big book, and when you open it, you always have one of these big pages, as you can see on the screen, in front of you. And this always covers 100 years, from here to here. The middle section gives you people who lived within the century, according to their birth dates and death dates. And also you have certain events that are categorized in different colors. This down here is wars and revolutions. Up there is inventions and economics, and also something that we would call maybe history of ideas or intellectual history. This is a practice where he tried to not only, to also kind of open this idea of collecting data about, in this case, historical societies, and not only having like a European view, but also making this, I'm always sort of hesitant to use the term global because it's much more complex, I think, than what I usually say with it. But it's trying to sort of open a perspective that goes beyond sort of the European perspective and give you information about historical events, whatever that is, and people that were present in a certain century. This is a picture of the data collected that is in the background. The Synchronoptische Weltgeschichte contains 12,162 events. Some of them are georeferenced, but not all of them. There's information about persons. There is a keyword register that is something like a dictionary, but there's no real understanding of why these words are the important ones. There are also connections within the data set, so which of the entries is sort of related to another one. And these are the entry cards that the people made in the 50s and 60s when the book was sort of put together. And you can see this is all typewriter. This is all German, unfortunately. And then you have different categories. You have some handwriting for the datings and all that kind of thing. So you can think of like a big Karteikartensystem that they had in order to make this work. And of course, this has been digitized now. And although I say this myself, it basically looks the same. Same effort, same data set, same representation. So when I first opened this, I was a bit disappointed because I thought, okay, you have this big data set, so what do you do with it? First of all, and this is something that happens in digital humanities and digital history most of the time, it can be read as something that is called a proof of concept. So I show you that my digital version can do the same thing that the paper version can. And once I've established that, I can take the next step and show you what the digital version can, what the paper version cannot, which is basically, in this case, rearranging information and sort of digging deep into the connections that are present in the database. So again, I explained this before. So here's the people. Then there's events in these different categories. You have some pictures. You can now, this is interactive, so you can click on it and then you can see sort of the information that was entered. So this is the first upgrade that the digital version has over the paper version. And this is, oh, sorry, I have this in bigger, so you can have a closer look. This is the 14th century. Again, there's the medieval training coming through at some points. This is more interesting because this is a visualization that the digital version of the Synchronoptische World History offers us that gives us a different view on the data sets that they have. This, going back one, is still a representation of history in a straight line. This is a very traditional, very linear, very kind of Ereignisgeschichte, history of events kind of approach. Also, important people, most of them are male. I'm just mentioning this because, it's part of the truth. But now you can kind of rearrange the data points and play around with the perspective also on history as something that happens in time. What this visualization does is you have one of the events in the middle. In this case, this is the same event that I had the information card about. It's 1331, the invention of cannons, or the first use of cannons in Friaul in Italy. And then you can see other events or entries in the database that are related to the one in the middle. It's not linear anymore. It's more layered, right? So I have sort of time layers that surround the event in the middle. So the further away on the layers, the further away in time. And this can be either before or after. So it's not a linear. So this is not early and this is late. It's just sort of the absolute distance. And the size of the nodes represents the semantic relation or the closeness of the events to each other in a more hermeneutic way. Interesting is we try to understand how this works computationally, and it's just random. It's really random. But the idea is that the bigger the node, the closer the events are to each other, like semantically or hermeneutically speaking. Just one example down here is the Hussites who use the Haubitze for the first time. So this, I get, is quite similar as a event. So they developed a weapon, they're using it for the first time. Okay, right, so that those are more or less related. I get that. So I think this shows that data sets and the way, or rather the way that we use, in this case, visualizations and representations of data sets that already exist or that we kind of also generate, changes our perspective on the kinds of stories that we tell. If I use this, I'm not going to start linear. I'm going to start in a relational way. So this is a representation of a relational way to tell historical or build historical narratives, rather than just having it in a linear way. And this is, I think, one of the, one takeaway for me, using these kinds of visualizations and playing around and exploring different kinds of visualizations for the same data sets helps me to sort of open up different perspectives and maybe gain more than just one perspective on a certain historical topic. So I already started with my last example to go into the complex of questions that I want to talk about now. Is it really data versus stories? Or how do stories maybe also consist of data? Or how do certain data arrays or arrangements, data sets, visualizations guide the way that I tell stories? I could now also give you a lecture on what historians usually do, but I'm not going to do that, because I see some faces here that have done this for generations of students already, so we're not going to go down there. But I think it's important to reflect, and this is why I made so clear that I'm a digital historian, not only a humanist, I'm a historian first, because I have a certain approach and a certain kind that I ask my questions when I look at data sets. And I think this is important, because this is different to my computational literary scholars, colleagues. They work with data sets as well, they work with the same methods, but they have different sets of questions, and they want to sort of tell other stories, if we phrase it like that. Okay, so what we do as historians is, and I'm going to do this in just one sentence, we try to build plausible narratives about the past. It's important that they are plausible. They're not facts in and of itself. They consist of facts, they consist of data, but there's not just one story about something. So it's important to me that we sort of focus on the plausible, because I think that for historians and for other hermeneutic disciplines, some kind of vagueness and some kind of sort of interpretational leeway is really important to the way that we work. We always try to differentiate things. It's just not one way. There's the most plausible way, but it's not the only way. And this is something that is really complicated to match to data sets, because data sets usually are one way. They is one data point. It is one category. They might have different properties. Yeah, I can try to kind of build a complex data model where I have like lots of different layers in my annotation scheme, and it goes like a tree in sort of different directions. But basically, always have to make a decision if it is yes or no, and in the end. And this is something that can be very painful for historians if they have to make that particular decision in a historical case. And because it is so difficult and sometimes painful, it is important to dwell on this maybe just for 3 seconds longer. Historical narratives might be based on data, or are basically always based on data if you think of all kinds of information can be data, that represent a certain perspective. It's always made. Johanna Drucker, one of, I think, the most interesting and also sort of already long-term digital humanists in the United States, she, in one of her publications, she claims that we should stop calling it data and start calling it capta, from Latin catching. Because data is always a given, that's sort of the literal translation. And she says we should rather call it capta because it is something that we take and that we form and that we sort of decide what it should look like. And I think this is important. Every database has a perspective. It's not just there because it is there. Even the decision that the people of the Global History Data Bank made, do I calculate heads? How big is the area that I define as the area? You know, this is all part of that particular perspective. And this is true for narratives as well as for data sets. There's no difference. Maybe narratives can be more elaborate about this. Data sets need a really good documentation that people can follow in order to understand this. If this is true, that they are all dependent on a certain perspective, they are oriented in knowledge orders and models. So there's a certain understanding. I think I started this talk also with making the point that it's always also about sort of a hidden understanding of something. If I make a database, I have presumptions. And I think that what historians can learn in the process of creating databases that need a good documentation is to be more precise about what we think that these presumptions are. Because we usually work in footnotes, which are also very differentiating. Maybe, you know, there's still interpretation and arguments. And I think we can learn from documentation to process the research decisions that we make, document them more closely. And I think this is like another takeaway if you work with data. Not to say digitally, because we all work digitally, but to work with data. I'm coming back to that perspective maybe in a bit. The last point on this slide is something that I will come to later when I give you some examples of visualizations. I think that one point or one element of also the digital version of the Peters helps to understand this, let's call it perspectiveness, or being bound to a certain perspective, this is interactive. I can change the perspective and I see the image changing. I think this is really important to give users this understanding of, if I stand on another point in the data set, I see other things around me. And this is basically the starting point for the virtual reality project, which basically works like this. I can stand within a knowledge graph on a certain node, and then I can move, and then the whole thing changes around me, so that I understand I can only see sort of in this cone in front of me. Maybe I have to turn around to see something that is almost as interesting, but I've never looked at this part of the knowledge graph before. So narratives are one perspective. They might be multi-layered and have sort of integrate more than one perspective, but in the end, if you tell the story, it comes to one certain maybe set of perspectives. Same is true for data sets. Can we then use data sets maybe also in the same way and make them tell stories? Or how do we, and this is one of the questions that I started off with, how do we combine data and storytelling? And one format that we use also in teaching is data stories. This is nothing that we invented. Data stories is a thing, just not in history, but in lots of different areas. There's data journalists that basically produce data stories every day. In businesses that sell data, they sell data by telling stories with that particular data to make a selling argument. So data stories is a format that is something that is very present ever since we have lots of data sets that need to be sort of told or told about. And we tried to use data sets in a seminar again for a historical data story. And this data story is based on the Blumenbach Online. Blumenbach is a, let's call him ethnographer maybe, early or late 18th century. And he collected human remains, skulls in particular, in order to categorize humans in A, B, C, D, and so on categories. This is an event or sort of a situation that is often also retold in stories of racism and, you know, the sort of the idea that you can see at people and put them into certain categories. And he collected these skulls all over the world. And the Blumenbach archive in Göttingen, they have his correspondence, they have the routes that they have sort of the routes that skulls took. They have lots of metadata information on the skulls, and we used these data sets, or this particular data set, all surrounding the collection of Blumenbach to create a data story that basically looks like this. And this is German again, I apologize, but my students usually work in German, so we haven't yet had the chance to translate this. It's about collecting, describing, categorizing, about the, I think I gave it an English title, about the treatment of human remains at the beginning of modern science. Because what the students were most interested in is how does this collection of skulls relate to what we today think about how we deal with human remains. So this is the kind of story that they wanted to tell. And we had a data set, and then we tried to make a story out of it. And this is what the students did. So it has this opening teaser, basically. And then they decided that they wanted to track the movements of the skulls. And I think this is something that we in digital history, but maybe also, Manuel, in your group in computational history, what we often do is listen to someone who has an interest and has some material, and then try to design bits and pieces of sort of computational methods or visual representations that can help in telling the story. Most of the time, the digital history project does not just consist of one method, but it's a set of methods that represent different steps in the research process. So what we did is we wanted to follow the journey of the skulls, so we decided to do this with GIS methods, representations. So we designed interactive maps along 3 different points of the journeys. The first map is about where the skulls come from. And because I told you that for me it is important to make this interactive, or to give the users possibilities to sort of find their own interests in the data sets, we have marked down all the locations where the skulls came from and linked them to the metadata information about the skull that we had in the database. So this is basically information retrieval, right? It's just pretty. If you could do this also with like a search field in the database, but this is more nice. It doesn't do much more than that. The second thing that students wanted to look at, and in between these visualizations, they tell the story. They have, the historical information, and they give the narrative, and they give you more information about certain skulls. And then they wanted to show the places where the skulls went to and the routes that they took. This is not well done, because the routes all seem to be very straight. Obviously, that's not what happened. This is historically very incorrect, right? But this represents the points of data that we have. So the available data points often are, where does the skull come from? And then we maybe have 1 or 2 brokers in between. So they were shipped to St. Petersburg, which is basically where, if you zoom into this, I think you can see this. Here, St. Petersburg, this person here, just lots of connections. There's also lots of correspondence between him and Blumenbach. Nikon Karpinski, he was one of the brokers that Blumenbach used to bring the skulls back to Göttingen. So we have some stations, but this is not a historically correct route that the skulls took, right? A part of the story that the students took was that one of the skulls, very old one, he was on the last bit of road just before Göttingen. The coach broke down, and then the box where the skull was in fell off the coach, and then it broke. So it had a very long story, but then it never arrived in Göttingen. This is what sort of the students tell you in the story. And then the last step was that we were thinking about, okay, so we have the point where they start, we have the route that they take, or the route that they take. Then they arrive in Göttingen, but then we would have just one bubble in Göttingen. So again, the logic of the visualization also helps you tell the story in a way that people can understand what you're trying to say. It's not an obvious sort of visual representation. It's always also a decision, part of the storytelling. So what we did was we went back to the information of where the skulls came from, but the colors and the letters represent the categories that Blumenbach later invented, or that he built from the skulls. And then you can see, have your own thoughts about whether or not this works at all. But again, you can click on them, and then you get sort of the database information. So there is a way to still tell stories with data and integrate data in your stories with interactive visualizations. It's just a different format, right? It's not telling stories. It's not using data. It's just trying to explore ways to combine the two. Yeah, okay. I'm going to do this quickly because this is boring. This is what I do every day. So for me, it's boring, at least. I work on court records, medieval court records, from the so-called justices in Eyre. That's basically the king's judges in the 11th century. They started to not only stay at Westminster Court and receive all the litigants at Westminster, but they started to go to the people and bring them the king's justice. That's more or less the story. And they had this very long way that they covered. This took about 2 years to go from one end to the other. And this is, I'm just going to show you this quickly. This is now an example for not using existing data, but me being a medieval historian interested in court records, trying to turn this into data that I can then use with quantitative methods. So what we do is we train machine learning algorithms in reading the scripts or transcribing the handwritten scripts. We turn this into machine-readable text, and then we use lots of different natural language processing tools to treat the texts with. So named entity recognition, automatic recognition of person names, of locations, for example, trying to then build networks. We try to look at or to understand what are the legal terms that are present in the earlier records versus the later records. So trying to find the sort of how do these different legal categories stabilize over time. And because I have a big corpus, they started to collect these kinds of court rolls from about 1180 until the 19th century. I'm going to stop somewhere way before that. But you could do this in a really large scale study if you had the tools, the time, the resources to digitize it all in a way that would make this possible. And we deal with metadata and textual data when we do this. We also deal with person names. And what you usually do if you identify people, you build networks, right? Because this is a go-to method if you want to think about the relation again. I think I started off with, also I made this point earlier that I'm about relations and relational history. So I did this little plot. It's not one network, as you can see, it's lots of really tiny networks that just connect 3 or 2 or 4 nodes with each other. What you can see here, every gray node is a court case. And the other nodes are the people involved in the court case. So it's usually 2 people, 1 case. Sometimes it's more, but that's sort of the usual thing. And then the color of the nodes tell you which social strata or category these people come from. Because I'm interested to see how the social strata that I am expecting in a medieval society is represented in these court records. Is it villagers against villagers? Is it villagers against regional landholders? Is it knights against clerics? What are the social connections that are built in the situation in court, right? Because these are people that usually maybe not talk to each other on the street, but if they have a legal battle, they need to. So what is the area, the court, the area as an area of social interaction does to this? And as you can see, these cases connect different people. But sometimes people also connect cases. And sometimes only people connect to each other. And these are different observations that I can make on like a pattern level, pattern recognition mechanisms that I can use that help me ask questions that will then bring me back to the text. So this is not a result of any kind. This is just one further step in the research process. If I'm interested in the kinds of networks that are represented, I would now go back and see, okay, this one here, is this a mistake? Is there just no case mentioned? I did go back, and it's actually a retrial of a previous case. So the case is not mentioned anymore. It's just about the people. They come back to court like a week later and just continue. But because it's further down in the document, it appears as a single entry. So I learned something about the structure of the document also from the personal network. And I think this is very important, that you learn how to read the visualizations and learn how to read the kinds of data points that you have in order to get all the factors into your story again. Because I think that, or I observe that one of the main arguments against working with data often is, what do you do with context? If you isolate something as a data point, how do you get the context information back in, which is one of the most important things for historical interpretations. And this is sort of one way that I use these visualizations that bring me back to the context and that I understand the way that the documents are structured, for example. So for me, digital history and also the way that data is used in historical storytelling is quantitative methods. I would rather call myself a data historian than a digital historian, because I think that's the differentiation is much clearer if I do that than just say I work digitally, because, you know, who doesn't? But just a few points on this slide. So when I use these kinds of methods for interpretations of data that I created, it is important to think about this as methods of pattern recognition that allow you to make observations that you cannot make when you just read a text, because texts are organized sequentially, it's linear, it has a certain order, it represents, and it's not, I'm not saying that you don't read anymore, it's just a different perspective that you then have to bring together again. It's about modeling of research questions and thinking about how can I operationalize certain sets of or certain questions within my research focus in a way that I can use formalized and quantitative methods. These networks don't make sense for all the questions that you could ask for the court records, right? It's just one particular set. Unfortunately, this means that research questions need to be formalized in order to be able to do this. And this is true for any kind of data set. If you want to match a data set, even social strata data or social surveys that are already existing, you kind of have to match your research interest with something that is very formalized, that is very strictly organized. And sometimes our questions are not. Maybe, again, there's a chance to sort of bring these two kinds of perspectives together. And I say it again because you always have to make people aware. Formalization needs documentation. Just you have to really make sure that everybody understands the decisions that you made so that they can use the data that you produce. It's an iterative process. It's just part of the research process. Visualizations and these kinds of things that I'm showing you is never, for me, the end of the line. It's part of, I produce a new set of information that I then use in order to combine quantitative modeling and qualitative interpretation. This is the virtual reality application now. Maybe we can do this over drinks. I thought I would show you this. I will show you later. And I will solve the riddle of the acronym. What we try to do is, in order to link quantitative observations and sort of data visualization and information I get from looking at things to understanding that I am always situated, is basically exactly this. So you are in a space that looks like space, and you can move around these knowledge graphs. This is taken, so we started to model this according to the Peters synchronoptischer Weltatlas that I showed you, or Weltgeschichte. The problem is that we understood that the way that these networks are built are totally random, because there's no, I mean, it's sort of computational, but they calculated the size of the nodes, which represented the semantic closeness of two events to each other. And they didn't use like the same keyword every time. They had a very complex set of calculations, what is an important keyword, and it was just not understandable, which I translate as random. It's obviously not random at all, but it doesn't have a good documentation, so you can't really understand what the relations are. Wikipedia, Wikidata, and DBpedia have a very much better documentation of the kinds of relations that they make. So this is basically what you see here. This is a medieval 100 years war knowledge graph taken from the DBpedia database. And if we have some time later in the discussion, maybe I can also show you this. But to solve the riddle of the ETADIS, I just point to this.
I hoped to be.
And actually, to give you a little anecdote, so the professor that I started this project with, he said he was from computer vision and computer visualization. He did the whole 3D calculations. And he said, okay, Silke, we can do this, but it has to be Doctor Who. So we knew the thing had to be called TARDIS in some kind of combination. And it was the Exploration, yes. Sorry, I'm laughing about myself. It's the Exploration temporaler und räumlicher Daten in immersiven Szenarien. So it actually has a title that later then came to this acronym, but the acronym was first. And I do believe that lots of projects work like that. You have an acronym and you kind of make the title work to that. Okay, so maybe we can have a look at this later. To come to an end, because I think I've been kind of approaching the end of this. Do numbers tell stories? I don't know whether this is a yes or no answer, as most historical questions are not a yes or no answer. I can maybe leave it like this. What I wanted to point out, and what is important to me, is that stories and narrations have many forms. I showed you like a format of data stories, for example. But a data set also is basically a representation of a story insofar as it is linked to certain presumptions, representing certain perspectives. It's just not neutral because it's in the world, right? Important for me also because I think a lot and write about the role that visualizations have in this whole process of interpreting data sets for historians. Visualizations also tell stories. You always decide what you can see and what you need to hide. They represent data models and make certain information visible and others invisible. And this is what narratives do, right? So you tell a story, you pick out something that is really important, maybe because it's exemplary or representative, or maybe it's the outlier, and that's what's interesting for you. But you will never give us the whole picture. And this is what visualizations do. They give you patterns, and then you can you can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can include something, exclude something. You can say, just give me the unknown data points because I'm interested in all the facts that we don't have and try to think about why we don't have this. So I think this also helps us to give a new perspective to our own stories. Visualizations help with the analysis of data because it just helps you to see. But it's also really important to think about visual literacy, to understand what happens when you see, right? And to make sure, again, that people know that this is a game of hide and seek, basically. So figuring out the past, and this is not, with this I don't mean the book, because I think I said lots about the book. It's really interesting, but you know. But figuring out the past, maybe as a metaphorical phrase, is a multi-layered process involving different steps and methods, and some of them can be computational. Some of them can relate to data. And you use the data, the stories that are sort of encompassed in data sets to give you a new insight, maybe. And numbers can be part of the stories we tell, and they can help with plausibilization. I think in the little text that I sent you to announce the talk, I said that this is something that we sort of expect from data sets nowadays. You know, if you can assign a number to something, say 80% of people say this and that, this is how people plausibilize the story, right? It's more plausible if more people say this. Or a YouTube video is especially true, like if you look at the history channels, when lots of people like it. I don't know, you know, it's a weird way to validate this, but this is what happens, right? If you Google something, just because something is sort of the top answer doesn't make it true or false or anything. So these mechanisms are also numbers that sort of influence the way that we understand the world, the way that people treat facts, the way that you build plausible narratives without ever documenting the way that led you to that particular plausible story. And authorship and perspective are inscribed in all forms of storytelling. And this is the point that I made with the interactive design of visualizations and also of our virtual reality application. I think it's important to let people know that they can direct their own perspective, that they can find their own view on things. And that it's necessary that if they can do this, then probably the people designing the data set have already done this also. So it's not just a neutral relationship. So yes, numbers tell stories sometimes, but sometimes also stories produce numbers. And I hope that you enjoyed this little ride through what I think data and stories and digital history have to tell each other. Thank you very much.
All right, I think it's now time for discussion, and I forgot an important hint in the introductory part. Please don't run away after the discussion, because there will be food and drinks afterwards, nearby, I guess. So yeah, and we can also continue the discussion, as you mentioned, with foods and drinks. But first, discussion.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I was wondering also, as a historian and as a practitioner of digital history, if like the problem of ambiguity isn't in part one that is self-created by speaking of data. Because like if you go back to history and one will talk about visualizing sources which come from different standpoints, different institutions, and so on, like that would always be in our mind. Whereas if one talks about data, it has like this unambiguous, almost positivist connotation, which one then needs to question in a second step. But wouldn't it be like, or why do you speak about data and not sources and this connection?
Good point. Again, it's all about perspective. But so I stress data because I think that the way that I work with the historical material that I call my sources is different to what other people do when they say I read a source. Because I change the object. If you think about the medieval manuscript that I showed you, the court protocol, taking a picture is already a representation and a move into another medium, because I don't have the parchment, I don't see the nicks and knacks and all the things on the margins and so on. But if you turn this into a TXT file and then use natural language processing methods where you don't really see a sequential text anymore, but you have this bag of words approach where all links and contexts are deleted and you use tokens as data points, I think that your research object has really changed. It's not a charter or a court record anymore. It was derived from that originally. So that's why I always say it is important that we clarify for us as historians that there's a difference between source and data. And I think this is also a discussion that I learned from research data management, that it's really important to think about, there's a broad understanding of research data where you say the source is part of the research data, and there's a narrow one where you say it becomes research data once I do something with it. So those would be sort of the two main reasons. I think it's a different object, and it is a different object because I changed it. So maybe, capta would be a better phrase in general, but that's why I would always say this is data, and it's not just a source. But you could go back, or maybe you need to go back and say, it's not the original source, but I can treat it as if it were some kind of source, because I have to be critical, right? So I have to know who did it, what is the author, all the questions that we usually ask when we use sort of the material from archives or archival research.
More questions? Okay, I might take the chance to ask a question myself. Mm-hmm. So great talk, thank you. I was really intrigued by it's kind of trivial, I guess, but but I mean, at one point you said, so it was about using data to tell stories, right? Mm-hmm. And when historians use data, they tell a story from a certain perspective, and then you switch back to the interactive visualizations and made the point that these visualizations can change the perspective mm-hmm. in an interactive way. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's not just in digital humanities interactive visualizations, it's basically the whole toolbox we have in digital humanities, right? Mm-hmm. We have many ways to change parameters in topic models or mm-hmm. stylometry. And I mean, in fact, I think we've seen a lot of abuse of these methods because very often people change these parameters in a black box until mm-hmm. they get a perspective they like. Yeah. And it's very often very random because they change the perspective and they manipulate parameters, mm-hmm. But they don't really understand what they changed and how mm-hmm. a specific distance measure influences the visualization. And I was just wondering, so you mentioned how important in history studies source criticism is. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder what you think about the importance of also being critical about tools and knowing how switching certain parameters and changing certain variables influences the actual perspective on the data. Yeah,
I think it's really eminently critical that you also learn about tool criticism and think about, because again, and this is so weird, we've been having a conversation earlier today about that we read articles from 10 years ago, and we kind of have the impression that we talk about the same problems, even though we have all this time passed. And I think that sort of, I have lots of conversations with students, but also with other researchers about, and they have this expectation that data sets, anything that has to do with a computer, is more neutral than if they would read it and write it themselves, or if they could see the person that is kind of behind the tool. Which I think is one layer why tool criticism is so important, because of course even creating the tool and manipulating the tool in the way that you just said is always intentional, and it has a certain perspective. So this is really, really important, which is why in teaching and also in other contexts, I really like to start exploring with something like Voyant tools, which is a web application that everybody can use. It's an out-of-the-box tool that gives you some understanding of how these quantitative methods and visualizations work. But it doesn't give you enough, if you're interested, if you're hooked, when you all see these beautiful visualizations, doesn't give you the chance to then go back into and do all the proper manipulations that you would actually need to, to get what you're interested in. But I think sort of the process and understanding that these tools just give you something, that is a very particular something, and that you have to understand how this comes into being, and then go back and learn about, okay, how does this work? And again, for example, in research papers, and I think we should talk a lot about also data publications, not just sort of the usual research paper that historians write, but make it more about the data set, make it more about the tools, and be more transparent about the process and document the several steps that we did. For example, my little collection of network graphs, I could have just hidden the one that didn't have a case, but then I wouldn't have seen something that really helped me understand the material that these network graphs were coming from. So again, we have to have an understanding of the tools, and we have to be critical about the way that they were designed, because some of, or most of the methods were, like the trick is none of them, I mean, maybe this is polemical, but almost none of them were designed for historical research. So we take something that was designed for a very different purpose, and we think that we can now use this and apply it to historical circumstances, contexts, documents, corpora, and texts, and so on. And that's just too easy because it doesn't work. So yeah, I think that having like a clear understanding, critical understanding of tools, data sets, and sources is eminently important.
Thank you. More questions? Daniel?
Yeah, thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I've got a half question, half comment. I would like to ask you to comment on my comment. So you truly criticized expressed the importance of data literacy and data criticism, which is to no offense, which is to some degree it's trivial, because we are kind of everyone who works with data at some point gets to the point to discover that. But my idea and my thought is data modeling allows contradictory statements, allows multi-layered analysis. We've got the option, the tools and the ways of how to model data. They are there already, but I don't have an overview of all the digital history studies. I'm not a historian myself, so I don't have an idea. But what I know is that it's possible to, if you annotate an historical text, for instance, as you do, you could, and of course there is always a step of interpretation. But I would argue there's not an infinite numbers how to integrate that. But more than one, at least. You could do that. It's much more effort, but one could do that and compare the different interpretations and the different annotations, and to even model contradictory narratives, contradictory statements, analysis, and I'm wondering why. A part of that's a much more effort to do, but that's the chance we have to write a new history. And this kind of new history will not be like a completely new history, telling completely new things, but comparing different perspectives, being more multidimensional. So, and I'm just wondering, why are we still on the step before of that level? I mean, people do, and as Manuel Burkhardt mentioned before, people tend to use, let's say, the default parameters. The example you say, okay, people just bend things as they wish, and I would argue other people just use the default parameters, not being aware of what would change the output, how the output would change. So it was more like a comment than a question, but maybe you could comment on this.
I can.
You can ask a question.
I can ask a question. No, I totally agree with what you described as what is possible, including the statement that it takes a long time and it needs a lot. It's a group effort, really, most of the time. And I think this is where. So I totally agree with you. And in a perfect world, I would always try to create annotation schemes or sort of data sets the way that you said. Not only matching and making it all look the same, like, for example, the figuring out the past book kind of, in my view, tried to do. How do we describe societies today? Let's take the same thing, describe past societies. And then it gets shaky, right? So you could integrate this, and you should integrate this. But I'm a digital history professor at like a very normal German history department. I do have a large group because I've got lots of projects. But I think that I still make this argument towards other historians and also towards sort of institutional contexts to make sure that we need the resources to use those possibilities. And if you, like, for example, I'm going to just show you the video. And now it doesn't work. But basically, this project kind of came from this idea to try to design not only another network graph, but try to design a multi-perspective, multi-layered environment in which I can interact with data points to paint a picture of possibilities. This took forever. It was very expensive. It is running, so visit our webpage. You can actually, use this on the screen. Visit Bielefeld, and you can actually use this with your headset, VR headsets and so on. So long story short, I totally agree with you. And I think that the reason why I still start at the point where I'm starting is because I direct this towards my own discipline to be more explorative and take the opportunities that are there more openly and give us the resources to do so.
All right, thank you. I think we might have time for a very short last question. Okay, in a room full of historians, no short question. Oh.
Just a short question, getting back to what... Okay. Getting back to what Julius asked about what is data, what are the sources, and I found it interesting what you said. So data is what you create yourself, more or less, and the other things are there also. And I don't know. So the background is that also in our SFB we discussed at length what are the data actually that we're supposed to manage and so on, and how is it different from the sources and material. And I think what the perspective or the definition you provided now gives then the impression, but of course also the sources are not just there, someone did something to them before, put them, selected them and so on. And at the same time, if you work with the data from others, it's also, then we call it data, but also someone else created it. So I'm not sure if may I also find your distinction a bit difficult. I understand it, but, and of course, it's not just a question about denomination and how to define things, but then also to get to the point, what is different now with the digital is, I don't know, talking also in the NFDI for memory, what is different with the digital source criticism now? How is it different from the traditional source criticism? So, I don't know, it's also not really a question, maybe a comment. Maybe you want to comment.
Like to your last point, what are the differences? I think this is really not trivial because I think that in the world that we live in and with the tools that we have at our disposal, lots of things can be called digital humanities or digital history already. And if you read something printed out or like a book and you use your pencil to make notes, or you use this on a tablet and you use a pencil to make notes, that's not a real difference, right? So you shift the medium, okay, check. And there's studies that, reading digitally is different to reading books, all that taken into account. But it doesn't really change our practices so much because we still read and annotate. And I think it is and I'm not answering the question, but I think it's really important to stick with that question and see which kinds of practices do we just transfer into the digital, and where does the digital actually transform the practice? And I think this has not been sufficiently answered. And I think this is also why it's not only the digital, but it's the specific computational methods. It's sort of the opening of possibility spaces like VR or whatever you have, where you can really explore the transformations and see, okay, what is it that we could not have done before? And I also don't like that the argument often is that I can now have 4,000 sources instead of 100. Yeah, okay, so that's scaling, fine, but is that a transformation? Does that really change the way that we think about stories? And that was sort of part of the argument that I wanted to make. That I think that we have the potential to actually think about stories in a different way, and also maybe use this along the lines of digital history to also teach people more about perspectives. Use these kinds of methods not only for our own research, but use it to teach people about history and the perspectiveness of an historical argument. And I think the source and the data thing, yeah, maybe data sets should then be treated as sources, and we need sort of rules for source criticism for data sets. In this regard, data is also a source. But the main argument that I wanted to make towards also Julius's question is that for me it's too easy. If I ask people with what kinds of data do they work, and they sort of show me a picture of like a medieval manuscript, then I need something to start a conversation, right? So I think it's important to make the differentiation between a manuscript and a data set, but both can be sources. Maybe that's like more correct to sort of have a look at this.
All right, I think that's the end of the official discussion part. Thank you so much, Silke, for this talk.
Thank you for your questions.